Welcome back to another journey through the shadows of history. Tonight, we're stepping into the dimly lit parlors of Victorian England, where the living gathered around polished mahogany tables to speak with the dead. Close your eyes and imagine yourself settling into a comfortable chair, the weight of the day slowly lifting from your shoulders as we explore a time when the boundary between this world and the next seemed paper thin. While you're getting comfortable, please subscribe and comment below where you're watching and what time it is there. The Victorian era was a period of remarkable contradictions. While steam engines thundered across the countryside and gas lamps illuminated the growing cities, people found themselves drawn to something far more mysterious and intangible. Death was a constant companion in those days. Families lost children, two diseases we now prevent with simple vaccines, and the average lifespan was barely half of what we enjoy today. Perhaps it was this intimate relationship with mortality that made the Victorians so eager to believe that death was not the end, but merely a doorway to another realm. Picture the scene: a modest drawing room in London, perhaps in the 1870s. The heavy velvet curtains are drawn tight against the autumn evening, and a small fire crackles in the grate. The gaslight has been turned down low, casting dancing shadows across the wallpaper. Around a circular table sit 5 or 6 people, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of a single candle placed at the center. Their hands are joined, forming an unbroken circle, and in the hushed silence, you can hear nothing but the gentle ticking of the mantelpiece clock and the distant sound of horse hooves on cobblestones. This is where our story begins. In that moment of anticipation, when rational Victorian minds opened themselves to possibilities that daylight logic would never allow. Tonight, we'll explore why spiritualism captivated an entire generation, and why, perhaps, there were very good reasons to fear what they might find in those shadowy spaces between the living and the dead. The ritual of the Victorian séance began long before the participants ever sat down at the table. Picture yourself as a respectable member of the emerging middle class in 1875, London, perhaps a bank clerk or a shopkeeper's wife. You've received an invitation, written in elegant script on cream-colored paper, requesting your presence at Mrs. Adelaide Whitmore's residence for what the card discreetly refers to as an evening of spiritual inquiry. The very language speaks to the delicate balance these gatherings maintained between respectability and the forbidden. You arrive at the appointed hour, 7 o'clock sharp, your footsteps echoing on the wet cobblestones of a tree-lined street in Bloomsbury. The house is modest but well kept, with lace curtains in the windows and a polished brass knocker on the dark green door. Inside, the atmosphere is immediately different from a normal social gathering. The usual chatter and laughter of Victorian parlor life has been replaced by something more subdued, more reverent. The hostess greets you with a knowing smile and guides you to a sitting room where 5 other guests wait, each speaking in hushed tones about mutual acquaintances and the unseasonably cold weather. The preparation for a séance was as important as the event itself. Mrs. Whitmore, like many spiritualist hostesses of the era, spent considerable time arranging the room to create what she believed were optimal conditions for spiritual communication. The furniture had been moved to create a clear space around the circular table, and any mirrors in the room had been covered with dark cloth, a common practice based on the belief that spirits could become trapped in reflective surfaces. The temperature was kept deliberately cool, as many believed that spiritual entities drew energy from heat, and participants often reported feeling sudden drops in temperature when contact was made. The medium for this evening's session is Mrs. Florence Hartwell, a woman in her early 40s with graying hair and remarkably pale skin. She has a reputation throughout the district for her ability to contact the departed, and several of the other guests have attended her sessions before. You notice how the others defer to her slightly, offering her the most comfortable chair and speaking to her with a mixture of respect and barely concealed nervousness. Mrs. Hartwell herself appears serene, almost ethereal, as she arranges her personal items on a small side table. A silver locket containing a photograph of her deceased daughter, a piece of black ribbon, and a small vial of what appears to be salt water. As the grandfather clock in the hallway strikes 7:30, Mrs. Hartwell suggests that it's time to begin. She asks everyone to remove their jewelry and to place any metal objects on the mantelpiece, explaining that such items can interfere with spiritual energies. The sound of pocket watches, rings, and brooches being carefully set aside creates a gentle metallic chorus that seems to mark the transition from the ordinary world to something altogether more mysterious. The participants take their places around the table, and you find yourself seated between an elderly gentleman who introduces himself as Colonel Pemberton, recently retired from service in India, and a young woman named Miss Catherine Thornfield, whose black mourning dress suggests a recent loss. The table itself is made of dark mahogany, its surface polished to a mirror-like finish, and you can see the faces of your fellow participants reflected in its depths, their features wavering slightly in the candlelight. Mrs. Hartwell begins with what she calls the preparation of the circle. She instructs everyone to place their hands flat on the table, palms down, with their fingertips just touching those of their neighbors. The physical contact is meant to create an unbroken chain of human energy, a conduit through which the spirits can communicate. The sensation is surprisingly intimate. You can feel the warmth of Colonel Pemberton's weathered hand and the slight tremor in Miss Thornfield's fingers that suggests either excitement or fear. The medium then leads the group in what she calls a cleansing breath, a slow, deep inhalation followed by an even slower exhalation. The purpose, she explains, is to clear the mind of worldly concerns and to open the heart to spiritual influence. As you breathe in unison with the others, you become aware of the various scents in the room, the faint lavender water that Mrs. Whitmore favors, the lingering smell of the coal fire, and underneath it all, something that reminds you of old churches, a mixture of cold stone and aged wood. The silence that follows is profound. In the outside world, London continues its evening routine. Carriages rattle past. A street vendor calls out his wares, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolls 8 o'clock. But inside this circle, time seems to have stopped. Can you hear the breathing of your companions, the soft rustle of fabric when someone shifts slightly in their chair, and the steady tick of the mantelpiece clock that marks the passage of minutes with metronomic precision? Mrs. Hartwell's voice, when she finally speaks, is barely above a whisper. She begins with what she calls an invocation, a gentle request for any benevolent spirits who might be present to make themselves known. Her words are carefully chosen, respectful but not pleading, confident but not demanding. She speaks of the love that connects all souls, living and departed, and of the thin veil that separates the world of the living from the realm of the dead. As the minutes pass, you become increasingly aware of small changes in the room. The candle flame seems to flicker without any apparent draft. The shadows cast by the participants appear to shift and dance in ways that don't quite match their actual movements. Colonel Pemberton's breathing has become deeper and more regular, while Miss Thornfield's fingers have grown noticeably cooler where they touch yours. The temperature in the room has indeed dropped, just as Mrs. Whitmore had predicted, and you find yourself grateful for the woolen shawl you decided to wear. The waiting continues, and with it comes a growing sense of anticipation mixed with something that might be fear. This is the moment when rational minds begin to question what they're doing, when the comfortable certainties of Victorian life start to feel less solid. You think of your own losses, perhaps a parent who died when you were young, or a child who never lived to see their first birthday. The possibility that they might be near, that they might be trying to communicate, fills you with a mixture of desperate hope and profound unease. Mrs. Hartwell's breathing has changed now, becoming shallower and more irregular. Her eyes are closed, and her head has tilted back slightly, as if she's listening to something the rest of you cannot hear. The other participants seem to sense that something is happening. There's a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a feeling of potential energy building like the charged air before a thunderstorm. And then, just as you're beginning to wonder if this was all an elaborate exercise in group suggestion, something happens that makes your blood run cold. The table beneath your hands gives a slight shudder, barely perceptible at first, but unmistakably real. It's not the vibration of footsteps or the settling of old wood. It's something altogether more purposeful, more deliberate. The movement is followed by a sound so soft that you almost convince yourself you imagined it. A single, deliberate tap from somewhere beneath the table's surface. The single tap beneath the table surface creates a ripple of reaction around the circle. You feel Miss Thornfield's fingers tighten slightly against yours, while Colonel Pemberton's breathing becomes more controlled, as if he's drawing upon military training to maintain his composure. Mrs. Hartwell's eyes remain closed, but her lips curve into the faintest of smiles, the expression of someone who has successfully made contact with a familiar presence. The silence that follows the tap stretches for what feels like an eternity. In Victorian spiritualism, patience was considered a virtue. Rushing the spirits was thought to drive them away, or, worse, to invite less benevolent entities into the circle. You find yourself counting your heartbeats, wondering if the others can hear the blood rushing in your ears. The candle flame continues its subtle dance, casting shifting patterns of light and shadow across the faces around the table. Mrs. Hartwell's voice, when she speaks again, carries a different quality, softer, more distant, as if she's speaking from somewhere far away. She begins what spiritualists call the questioning, a careful process of establishing communication with whatever presence has made itself known. Her first question is always the same. Are you a spirit who wishes to communicate with those present? The response comes as two distinct taps, which, according to the established code, means yes. A single tap would mean no, while 3 taps indicate uncertainty or the need for clarification. The communication system used in most Victorian séances was remarkably sophisticated, developed over decades of practice and refinement. Letters could be spelled out using the alphabet, 1 tap for A, 2 for B, and so forth, though this method was reserved for particularly important messages, as it required tremendous patience from both the living and the dead. More commonly, spirits would respond to direct questions with the simple tap code, or would manipulate physical objects in the room to convey their presence and intentions. As the session progresses, you become aware of other phenomena beyond the table wrappings. The temperature in the room continues to drop, and you notice that your breath is beginning to form small clouds in the air. Mrs. Whitmore had mentioned this possibility, explaining that spirits often draw energy from their surroundings in order to manifest, but experiencing it firsthand is profoundly unsettling. The cold seems to come from within the circle itself, as if something is pulling warmth from the very air around the table. Mrs. Hartwell asks if the spirit has a connection to anyone present, and the response is immediate. 3 sharp taps that seem to come from directly beneath Miss Thornfield's chair. The young woman's face goes pale, and she whispers something about her brother, Edward, who died of consumption just 3 months ago. The medium gently asks if Edward is present, and the 2 taps that follow are so forceful that they seem to vibrate through the table and into your hands. The emotional impact of this moment cannot be understated. For Miss Thornfield, the possibility that her beloved brother might be trying to communicate represents both the fulfillment of her deepest hope and the realization of her greatest fear. Tears begin to flow silently down her cheeks, but she maintains her position in the circle, her hands trembling slightly as she asks, "Edward, is that really you? Are you ... Are you at peace. The response comes not as taps, but as something far more dramatic. The candle flame suddenly flickers and grows brighter, casting wild shadows across the walls before dimming to almost nothing. In that moment of near darkness, you hear something that makes your heart race. The sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the table. They're not the footsteps of anyone present. They have a different quality, lighter somehow, as if made by someone who weighs less than they should. Colonel Pemberton, his military bearing intact despite the circumstances, asks in a steady voice, "Can you give us another sign of your presence?" The response is immediate and unmistakable. The table begins to rock gently back and forth, as if pushed by invisible hands. The movement is rhythmic, almost hypnotic, and you find yourself swaying slightly in response to the motion. Mrs. Hartwell's voice takes on an even more distant quality as she enters what spiritualists call the receptive state. Her breathing becomes shallow and irregular, and her head tilts to one side as if she's listening to a conversation that only she can hear. When she speaks again, her voice carries a subtle change in accent and cadence, as if someone else is speaking through her. "Catherine," she says, using Miss Thornfield's first name, though it hasn't been mentioned during the session. "I want you to know that the pain has stopped. I can breathe freely now." The words have a profound effect on the young woman, who begins to sob quietly. Those who knew Edward would have been aware that his final weeks were marked by terrible difficulty breathing, a common symptom of advanced consumption. The specific reference to being able to breathe freely would have been particularly meaningful to his sister, who had watched helplessly as he struggled for every breath. The phenomena continued to escalate. The footsteps become more frequent, circling the table with increasing speed. The candle flame dances wildly, and several participants report feeling light touches on their shoulders and arms, as if invisible hands are reaching out to make contact. The temperature continues to drop, and frost begins to form on the windows. Despite the relatively mild October evening outside, Mrs. Hartwell, still in her trance-like state, begins to relay more specific messages. She speaks of Edward's gratitude for the flowers his sister placed on his grave, describes the blue woolen scarf he was buried in, and mentions his concern for their aging mother. Each detail is accurate, each reference meaningful only to those who knew the deceased. The evidential nature of these communications was what made Victorian spiritualism so compelling. The specificity and personal nature of the messages seemed to prove that contact with the dead was not only possible, but real. As the session reaches its climax, the phenomena become more intense. The table begins to lift slightly off the floor, supported by what appears to be nothing but air. Books on the shelves start to rattle, and the grandfather clock in the hallway strikes 9, even though it's only 8:30. The boundary between the world of the living and the realm of the dead seems to have become permeable, allowing energies and presences to flow freely between the two realms. But with this increased activity comes a growing sense of unease. The spirits that have been summoned are not the only ones present. You become aware of other presences in the room, shadowy figures that hover at the edges of your vision, whispers that seem to come from every direction at once. The Victorian spiritualists understood that opening the door to the spirit world was not without risks. That benevolent spirits were not the only entities that might answer their call. Mrs. Hartwell's breathing becomes more labored, and her face takes on a grayish pallor. The effort of maintaining contact with the spirit world is clearly taking its toll, and you begin to wonder if the medium is strong enough to control the forces she has unleashed. The temperature in the room has dropped so dramatically that your breath forms thick clouds, and ice crystals begin to form on the surface of the table. The session is approaching its natural conclusion, but the question remains, will the spirits willingly return to their realm, or has something been awakened that will prove impossible to dismiss? The answer comes with a suddenness that takes everyone by surprise. The gentle rocking of the table stops abruptly, as if whatever force had been moving it has suddenly withdrawn. The temperature in the room, which had been dropping steadily for the past hour, begins to stabilize, though the frost on the windows remains as evidence of what has transpired. Mrs. Hartwell's breathing gradually returns to normal, and her eyes slowly open, though they remain unfocused for several moments as she transitions back to ordinary consciousness. The silence that follows is different from the expectant quiet that had marked the beginning of the session. This is the silence of exhaustion, of minds struggling to process what they have witnessed. Each participant sits quietly, their hands still joined in a circle. Wait, but their thoughts turned inward as they attempt to reconcile their rational understanding of the world with the phenomena they have just experienced. Miss Thornfield is the first to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. Was that really Edward? The question hangs in the air, and you realize that this is the fundamental challenge that every spiritualist gathering must confront. How does one distinguish between genuine communication with the dead and the powerful combination of suggestion, coincidence, and desperate hope that can create the illusion of contact? Mrs. Hartwell, still pale and slightly disoriented, nods. Slowly, I believe it was, my dear. The details he shared, the manner of his communication, these are consistent with what I have observed in previous contacts with recently departed souls. Her voice carries the authority of experience, but also a note of caution. However, we must always remember that the spirit world is complex, and not all entities that present themselves are what they claim to be. This warning reflects one of the most troubling aspects of Victorian spiritualism: the growing recognition that the realm of the dead might harbor deceptive or malevolent presences. As the movement matured, experienced mediums began to report encounters with spirits that seemed to delight in providing false information, or worse, entities that appeared to feed on the emotional energy of the living. The Victorian spiritualists developed elaborate protocols for testing the authenticity of spirit communications. But these safeguards were not always effective. Colonel Pemberton's military pragmatism, evident even in these extraordinary circumstances, asks the practical question that is on everyone's mind. How do we end this safely? How do we ensure that whatever we have contacted returns to where it belongs? His concern is well-founded, as there are numerous accounts from the period of séances that seem to open doorways that prove difficult to close. Mrs. Hartwell explains the closing ritual, procedure as important as any part of the séance. She instructs the participants to maintain their circle while she formally thanks the spirits for their communication and requests that they return to their rest. The language is ceremonial but firm, acknowledging the gift of contact while clearly establishing boundaries. "We thank you for your presence," she says, her voice stronger now, "and we ask that you return to your peaceful rest, knowing that you are remembered with love." The response to this dismissal is immediate. The remaining coldness in the room begins to dissipate, and the subtle sense of presence that had permeated the gathering starts to fade. The candle flame steadies, burning with a clear, unwavering light that seems to signal the return of ordinary physical laws. The frost on the windows begins to melt, leaving tiny rivulets of water that catch the light like tears. But the ending of a séance is not simply a matter of spiritual dismissal. It also involves the careful management of the participants' psychological state. The transition from the heightened awareness of the séance to ordinary consciousness can be jarring, and experienced mediums understand the importance of helping their guests process what they have experienced. Mrs. Hartwell asks each person to share their impressions, not to validate or debunk what has occurred, but to help integrate the experience into their understanding of reality. The elderly gentleman speaks of feeling his late wife's presence, describing a subtle floral scent that reminded him of her favorite perfume. Mrs. Whitmore mentions the sensation of gentle hands touching her hair, what she associates with her departed mother. Each account is personal and specific, adding to the collective sense that something genuine has occurred, while also raising questions about the nature of memory, suggestion, and the human need for connection with the dead. As the circle is finally broken and the participants begin to collect their belongings, you become aware of how profoundly the experience has affected everyone present. There's a sense of shared intimacy, of having witnessed something that exists beyond the boundaries of ordinary experience. At the same time, there's an underlying current of unease, a recognition that the boundaries between life and death may be more permeable than Victorian society was comfortable acknowledging. The process of returning to the normal world is gradual. Mrs. Whitmore lights the gas lamps, filling the room with warm, steady light that banishes the mysterious shadows of the séance. The furniture is quietly moved back to its usual positions, and the mirrors are uncovered, reflecting the familiar faces of the participants rather than the strange, flickering images that had danced in the candlelight as you prepared to leave. Wrapping your shawl around your shoulders and gathering your gloves and reticule, you find yourself changed by the experience. Whether or not you believe that genuine contact with the dead has occurred, the séance has opened a door in your mind. Two possibilities that you had never seriously considered. The rational, ordered world of Victorian society suddenly seems less certain, less permanent than it had appeared just a few hours earlier. The walk home through the gaslit streets of London takes on a different quality. The shadows between the streetlights seem deeper, more mysterious. The sound of your footsteps echoes differently, as if someone else might be walking alongside you. When you finally reach your own door and step into the familiar comfort of your home, you find yourself checking the locks more carefully than usual. And when you lie down to sleep, you wonder if the dreams that come will be entirely your own. Victorian séance has ended, but its effects will linger. In the days and weeks that follow, you will find yourself thinking about the experience, analyzing every detail, wondering what was real and what was imagination. You will discover that once the door to the spirit world has been opened, it is never entirely closed again. The boundary between life and death has become more permeable. And you will carry with you always the memory of that moment when the impossible seemed to become possible. This is the true power and danger of Victorian spiritualism, not the dramatic phenomena or the emotional revelations, but the subtle way it changes one's perception of reality itself. The séance may have ended in silence, but its echoes will resonate through your life, reminding you that the world is far stranger and more mysterious than you had ever imagined. The phenomenon of spiritual communication that you witnessed in Mrs. Hartwell's parlor was not unique to that particular evening, nor to that particular medium. Across Victorian Britain, and indeed throughout the Western world, similar scenes were playing out in drawing rooms, rented halls, and private homes. The period between 1850 and 1900 saw an explosion of interest in what was then called spirit communion, a movement that attracted everyone from grieving parents to distinguished scientists, from working-class laborers to members of the aristocracy. To understand the voices from the other side, we must first understand the mediums who claimed to channel them. These were individuals who believed themselves to possess a special sensitivity to the spirit world, a natural ability to perceive and communicate with the dead. The majority were women, a fact that reflected Victorian beliefs about feminine intuition and emotional receptivity. Society viewed women as more naturally attuned to the spiritual realm, their supposedly delicate nervous systems making them ideal conduits for otherworldly communication. The most famous medium of the era was undoubtedly Daniel Douglas Home, a Scottish-born spiritualist who amazed audiences across Europe with his apparent ability to levitate, handle burning coals without injury, and produce musical sounds from instruments that no living person was touching. Home's séances were legendary for their theatrical quality, but also for the careful documentation provided by skeptical observers. who came away convinced that they had witnessed genuine supernatural phenomena. Consider the account of Lord Adair, who attended numerous séances with Home and meticulously recorded his observations. In one session, held in a London townhouse in 1868, Adair described how an accordion placed in a cage began to play melancholy tunes while Home sat several feet away, his hands clearly visible on the table. The music that emerged was not random notes, but recognizable melodies, hymns, popular songs, pieces that held special meaning for the deceased relatives of those present. The mechanics of such phenomena fascinated Victorian investigators. They theorized that spirits, lacking physical bodies, required some form of energy to manipulate objects in the material world. This energy, they believed, was provided by the medium and the assembled participants, drawn from their vital force through some unknown process. The theory explained why mediums often appeared exhausted after particularly active sessions, and why séances were more successful when conducted by groups rather than individuals. Mrs. Emma Hardinge Britton, another prominent medium of the period, specialized in what was called inspirational speaking. During her public demonstrations, she would enter a trance-like state and deliver eloquent lectures on complex philosophical and scientific topics, speaking in voices and dialects that were clearly not her own. P.'s performances were particularly compelling because Mrs. Britton, despite her obvious intelligence, had received little formal education and claimed no expertise in the subjects she discussed while entranced. The phenomena reported at these gatherings extended far beyond simple table rappings. Witnesses described the appearance of ghostly hands that emerged from what seemed to be empty air, touching participants and even leaving behind physical evidence of their presence. These spirit hands were said to be cold to the touch, with a texture that was described as both substantial and somehow insubstantial, like flesh that had been drained of its warmth and vitality. Musical phenomena were particularly common at Victorian séances. Bells would ring without any visible cause, their tones pure and clear, but somehow mournful. Witnesses reported hearing full orchestras playing in empty rooms, the music seeming to come from all directions at once. Piano keys would depress themselves, in sequence, playing melodies that participants recognized as favorites of their departed loved ones. The emotional impact of these musical manifestations was profound. Music was considered a universal language that could bridge the gap between the living and the dead. The investigation of these phenomena attracted some of the most distinguished minds of the age. Sir William Crookes, a renowned physicist and chemist, spent years studying the medium Florence Cook, who claimed to materialize the full spirit form of a young woman named Katie King. Crookes' reports, published in respected scientific journals, described how Katie King would appear at séances, walking among the participants and conversing with them in a voice that was distinctly different from that of the medium. The process of materialization was described as gradual and mysterious. Witnesses reported seeing a faint luminescence appear in the darkened séance room, which would slowly coalesce into a recognizable human form. These materialized spirits were said to be warm to the touch, with pulses that could be felt and breath that could be seen in cold air. They would interact with the living participants, sometimes for hours at a time, before gradually fading back into the ethereal realm from which they had emerged. The psychological impact on those who witnessed such phenomena was profound. Dr. Alfred Russel Wallace, co-discoverer of the theory of evolution, became a committed spiritualist after attending séances where he claimed to have seen and spoken with his deceased brother. Wallace's scientific reputation lent credibility to the movement. It also highlighted the tension between rational inquiry and spiritual belief that characterized much of Victorian spiritualism. The voices from the other side were not limited to dramatic public demonstrations. In countless private homes, families gathered around Ouija boards and other spirit communication devices, seeking contact with their departed loved ones. These domestic seances were often more intimate and emotionally charged than public demonstrations, as participants had personal connections to the spirits they hoped to contact. The Ouija board, or talking board as it was sometimes called, became a popular tool for spirit communication. Participants would place their fingertips lightly on a small wooden planchette, which would then spell out messages by moving to different letters marked on the board. The messages that emerged were often coherent and meaningful, containing information that seemed to come from beyond the knowledge of the participants. The board's apparent autonomy was both fascinating and unsettling, as users reported feeling the planchette move with a force that seemed independent of their own will. The most disturbing aspect of these spirit communications was not their apparent impossibility, but rather their intimate knowledge of the living. The voices from the other side seemed to know secrets that had been carried to the grave, to understand the private sorrows and hidden fears of those who sought their counsel. This personal knowledge was what made Victorian spiritualism so compelling and, simultaneously, so terrifying. Consider the case of Mrs. Margaret Fox, one of the founding figures of modern spiritualism. In 1848, at her family's home in Hydesville, New York, she and her daughters claimed to have established communication with the spirit of a murdered peddler, whose body was allegedly buried in their cellar. The spirit communicated through a series of raps and knocks, answering questions with startling accuracy about events that had occurred years before the Fox family had moved to the house. The Fox sisters, as they came to be known, developed an elaborate system of spirit communication that would influence seance practices for decades to come. They claim that the spirit could answer any question by producing the appropriate number of knocks: 1 for yes, 2 for no, 3 for uncertain. More complex messages were spelled out using an alphabetical code, with the spirit knocking once for A, twice for B, and so forth. This laborious process often took hours to complete simple messages, but the content of those messages was frequently so specific and personally meaningful that witnesses found them impossible to dismiss as coincidence. Phenomena reported by the Fox sisters spread rapidly throughout America and across the Atlantic to Britain. Within a few years, thousands of people claimed to have experienced similar communications with the dead. The consistency of these reports across different locations and social classes lent credibility to the movement, though it also raised questions about the power of suggestion and mass hysteria that Victorian science was only beginning to understand. The voices that emerged during these sessions were not always benevolent. Many mediums reported contact with spirits who seemed angry, confused, or malevolent. These entities would disrupt seances with violent rappings, would move objects in threatening ways, or would communicate messages that were disturbing or harmful to the participants. The Victorian spiritualists developed the concept of earthbound spirits, souls who had died in states of strong emotion or unfinished business, and who remained trapped between the worlds of the living and the dead. Mrs. Catherine Barry, medium, working in Manchester during the 1870s, became infamous for her contact with what appeared to be the spirit of a man who had been executed for murder. During her seances, the entity would describe the details of his crime in graphic terms, would rant about the injustice of his punishment, and would sometimes attempt to influence the living participants to commit acts of violence. These sessions were eventually discontinued when several attendees reported experiencing violent impulses for days after the seances. The problem of identifying authentic spirit communication versus deceptive entities became a central concern for serious investigators. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, creator of Sherlock Holmes and a devoted spiritualist, developed elaborate protocols for testing the authenticity of spirit messages. He would ask spirits to provide information that could be verified through historical records, or to demonstrate knowledge that the medium could not possibly possess through normal means. One of Doyle's most compelling investigations involved a medium named Gladys Osborne Leonard, who specialized in what was called book tests. During these sessions, spirits would provide specific references to passages in books that the medium had never seen, giving precise page numbers and line counts that could be verified later. The accuracy of these references was often startling, with spirits directing investigators to passages that contained messages remarkably relevant to their personal circumstances. The physical phenomena associated with spirit communication continued to evolve throughout the Victorian period. Reports emerged of spirits that could produce writing without the use of human hands, creating messages in scripts and languages that the mediums did not know. These spirit writings would appear on blank paper, placed in sealed boxes, or would be found carved into wooden surfaces in rooms where no one had been present. Photography. A new technology in the Victorian era added another dimension to spirit communication. Several photographers claimed to have captured images of ghostly figures standing beside living subjects, figures that had not been visible during the actual photographic session. These spirit photographs became extremely popular, with grieving families paying substantial sums for images that appeared to show their departed loved ones still present among the living. The most famous spirit photographer was William Mumler, whose double exposure images convinced thousands of bereaved Victorians that he could capture the souls of the dead on film. Mumler's photographs typically showed his living subjects accompanied by translucent figures draped in flowing garments, their faces often bearing expressions of peace or concern. The emotional impact of these images was profound, offering visual proof of survival after death that seemed to transcend the limitations of mere testimony. The investigation of spirit photography revealed many cases of fraud, but also produced images that defied easy explanation. Sir William Crookes, applying his scientific expertise to the phenomenon, conducted controlled experiments with cameras and photographic plates that he personally prepared and monitored. Some of the resulting images appeared to show figures that could not be explained by any known photographic technique of the period. The business of spirit communication became increasingly sophisticated as the Victorian era progressed. Professional mediums established elaborate practices, complete with waiting lists of clients and detailed records of spirit contacts. Some mediums specialize in particular types of communication. Mrs. Piper of Boston became famous for her ability to channel a spirit guide named Dr. Finowit, who would diagnose illnesses and provide medical advice. Others, like Eusapia Palladino, focused on physical phenomena, producing levitations and materializations that amazed audiences across Europe. The emotional dependency that developed between mediums and their clients became a source of concern for Victorian society. Families would spend their life savings seeking continued contact with deceased relatives. Some individuals became so reliant on spirit guidance that they were unable to make decisions without consulting the other side. This psychological vulnerability made the spiritualist community particularly susceptible to exploitation by unscrupulous individuals who claimed supernatural abilities. The challenge of distinguishing genuine phenomena from clever deception became a driving force behind the establishment of psychical research societies. The Society for Psychical Research, founded in London in 1882, brought together scientists, philosophers, and other intellectuals dedicated to the systematic investigation of paranormal claims. Their reports, published in scholarly journals, provided detailed analyses of spiritualist phenomena while maintaining scientific objectivity about the ultimate reality of spirit communication. Yet, for every case of proven fraud, there remained incidents that seemed to defy rational explanation. The voices from the other side continued to speak, carrying messages of love, warning, and guidance that touched the hearts of those who heard them, while simultaneously challenging the very foundations of Victorian understanding about the nature of life, death, and the boundaries between the material and spiritual worlds. The most unsettling aspect of these otherworldly communications was their persistence. Unlike the brief, dramatic encounters that characterized public séances, the voices from the other side seemed to establish ongoing relationships with the living. Mediums reported that certain spirits would return again and again, developing what could only be described as friendships or, in some cases, unhealthy dependencies with those still inhabiting the physical world. Mrs. Leonora Piper, considered by many to be the most gifted medium of her generation, maintained regular communication with a spirit entity she called Dr. Fenouet for over 20 years. This spirit claimed to be a French physician who had died in the early 1800s, and he would speak through Mrs. Piper in heavily accented English, providing medical advice and personal guidance to her clients. What made Dr. Fenouet particularly compelling was his apparent ability to remember details from previous sessions, maintaining consistent relationships with regular visitors and referring to past conversations as they were ongoing dialogues rather than isolated supernatural events. The consistency of these spirit personalities raised profound questions about the nature of consciousness and identity after death. If these entities were truly the surviving spirits of deceased individuals, what did their continued existence suggest about the afterlife? The spirits often described their realm in vague, contradictory terms, sometimes speaking of peaceful rest, other times describing a state of confused wandering between worlds. Some claimed to be learning and growing in their spiritual state, while others seemed trapped in the concerns and emotions of their earthly lives. The physical manifestations that accompanied these voices became increasingly elaborate as the Victorian era progressed. Séance rooms would be filled with the sound of invisible orchestras, playing melodies that seemed to come from all directions at once. Witnesses described hearing full choirs singing hymns in empty air, their voices blending in harmonies that surpassed any earthly performance. These musical phenomena were particularly moving because they often featured songs that held special meaning for the departed or their surviving loved ones. The phenomenon of direct voice communication represented perhaps the most extraordinary claim of Victorian spiritualism. Unlike the usual method of spirit communication through a medium, direct voice séances featured spirits that seemed to speak directly into the séance room using their own vocal apparatus. These voices would emerge from various points around the room, sometimes conversing simultaneously with different participants, carrying on multiple conversations that would have been impossible for a single human medium to maintain. Leslie Flint, though slightly later than our period, exemplified this phenomenon when he demonstrated what he claimed was independent direct voice communication. During his séances, conducted in complete darkness with his mouth sealed with tape, multiple distinct voices would emerge from different locations in the room. These voices carried different accents, spoke in various languages, maintained separate conversations with different sitters. The personalities that emerged claimed to be deceased individuals from various historical periods, each maintaining consistent character traits and memories across multiple sessions. The emotional manipulation that these voices could exercise over the living was perhaps their most dangerous aspect. Spirits would claim special knowledge of their listeners' futures, would offer guidance on important life decisions, and would sometimes demand specific actions or offerings from those who sought their counsel. This spiritual authority could become psychologically overwhelming, particularly for individuals who were already vulnerable due to grief or personal crisis. The case of Mrs. Adelaide Thompson, a widow living in Yorkshire during the 1880s, illustrates the potential dangers of these spiritual relationships. After losing her husband in a mining accident, Mrs. Thompson began attending regular séances in hopes of maintaining contact with him. The spirit that claimed to be her deceased husband became increasingly demanding, instructing her to sell her property, dismiss her servants, and isolate herself from friends and family members who disapproved of her spiritualist activities. Over the course of 2 years, Mrs. Thompson lost her home, her social connections, and most of her inheritance before family members intervened to break what they recognized as an unhealthy spiritual dependency. The sophistication of these spirit communications continued to evolve throughout the period. Spirits began to demonstrate knowledge of complex, scientific, and philosophical concepts, discussing theories that were at the cutting edge of Victorian intellectual thought. They would engage in debates about evolution, electromagnetic theory, and other contemporary scientific developments, often displaying understanding that seemed to exceed that of the mediums through whom they communicated. The international nature of the spiritualist movement allowed for cross-verification of spirit communications in ways that would have been impossible in earlier eras. Spirits would claim to have appeared at séances in different countries, providing consistent details about their earthly lives and death circumstances that could be verified across multiple mediums and locations. This global consistency lent credibility to the movement, while also raising questions about the transmission of information that transcended normal, geographical, and cultural boundaries. The decline of Victorian spiritualism was as gradual as its rise had been dramatic. Scientific understanding of psychology and group dynamics advanced. Many of the phenomena that had seemed miraculous began to yield to rational explanation. The discovery of the ideomotor effect explained how Ouija boards could move without conscious direction, while studies of hypnosis and suggestion revealed how séance participants could unconsciously collaborate in creating apparently supernatural phenomena. The exposure of numerous fraudulent mediums dealt serious blows to the movement's credibility. Harry Houdini, the famous escape artist and magician, dedicated considerable effort to demonstrating how supposed supernatural phenomena could be duplicated through purely physical means. His public exposures of fraudulent mediums, conducted with scientific rigor and dramatic flair, helped shift public opinion away from supernatural explanations towards psychological and technological ones. Yet, even as the organized spiritualist movement declined, the voices from the other side continued to speak to those willing to listen. Private families maintained their séance practices. Individuals continued to report spontaneous contact with deceased relatives, and the fundamental human need to believe in survival after death ensured that spiritualist practices would persist in various forms well into the modern era. The legacy of Victorian spiritualism extends far beyond its specific practices and beliefs. The movement's emphasis on scientific investigation of paranormal claims established precedents for modern parapsychology, while its exploration of altered states of consciousness contributed to the development of modern psychology. Most significantly, spiritualism challenged the materialist worldview that was becoming dominant in Victorian society, insisting that human consciousness and personality might transcend the physical limitations of the brain and body. The voices from the other side that spoke so clearly to our Victorian ancestors continue to whisper at the edges of modern consciousness, reminding us that the boundary between life and death, between the known and the unknowable, remains as mysterious and permeable as it was in those gaslit parlors where the living gathered to speak with the dead. Whether these voices represent genuine communication with departed souls, or the complex manifestations of human psychology and social dynamics, they speak to fundamental questions about the nature of consciousness, identity, and the possibility that some aspect of human existence might survive the dissolution of the physical body. The most insidious danger of Victorian spiritualism was not the dramatic phenomena that captured public attention, but rather the quiet poison of deceptive messages that could destroy lives with surgical precision. The voices from beyond carried an authority that a few living persons could claim. After all, who would dare contradict the words of the dead? This spiritual authority created a unique vulnerability among the bereaved and desperate, a weakness that some entities seemed to exploit with calculated malice. Consider the tragic case of the Pemberton family of Gloucester, whose story was documented by the Society for Psychical Research in 1887. following the death of their eldest son Robert in a riding accident. The family began attending regular séances in hopes of maintaining contact with him. The spirit that claimed to be Robert initially provided comfort, sharing intimate family memories and expressing his love for those he had left behind. The communications were so convincing that the family became regular participants in weekly séances, building their entire emotional life around these otherworldly conversations. Gradually, however, the tone of the messages began to change. The spirit of Robert started making accusations against his younger brother, William, claiming that William had deliberately spooked his horse on the day of the fatal accident. These allegations were delivered with increasing vehemence over several months, accompanied by demands that William confess his crime and make amends for his murder of his brother. The psychological impact on the family was devastating. William fell into a deep depression, convinced of his own guilt despite having no memory of any wrongdoing, while his parents found themselves torn between their two sons, one living and one supposedly speaking from beyond the grave. The tragedy reached its climax when William, unable to bear the weight of accusations from beyond death itself, took his own life by drowning in the river Severn. Only then did investigators discover that Robert's horse had a documented history of nervous behavior, and that the accident had been witnessed by a gamekeeper who testified that William had been nowhere near his brother when the horse bolted. The spirit's accusations had been entirely false, but their supposed divine authority had been sufficient to drive an innocent young man to his death. The phenomenon of lying spirits was not an isolated occurrence, but rather a systematic pattern that emerged as spiritualism matured. These deceptive entities seemed to understand human psychology with frightening accuracy, targeting the specific fears and vulnerabilities of their victims. They would claim knowledge of family secrets, threaten to reveal embarrassing information, or promise rewards that never materialized. Most disturbing of all, they often spoke with the voices and mannerisms of genuinely departed loved ones, making their deceptions almost impossible to detect. Mrs. Elizabeth Hartwell, a widow living in Bath during the 1870s, became the target of what appeared to be the spirit of her late husband, demanding that she change her will to leave her entire estate to a local spiritualist church. The communications were so persistent and threatening that Mrs. Hartwell began to fear for her own safety. Convinced that her husband's spirit would torment her eternally, she refused his demands. The supposed spirit claimed intimate knowledge of their marriage, referencing private conversations and shared experiences that seemed to prove his authenticity. Only when Mrs. Hartwell's nephew investigated the spiritualist church did he discover that the medium conducting the séances had been systematically gathering information about wealthy widows from their servants and tradespeople, using this intelligence to create convincing impersonations of their deceased husbands. The psychological mechanism that made these deceptions so effective was the Victorian belief in the moral authority of the dead. In an era when death was seen as a purifying experience that elevated the soul to a higher plane of existence, the words of spirits carried a weight that few questioned. The dead were assumed to have gained wisdom and perspective that the living lacked, making their guidance inherently valuable and their judgments inherently just. This assumption created a dangerous blind spot that deceptive entities could exploit with devastating effectiveness. The case of the Mortons family of Essex illustrates how lying spirits could destroy relationships with surgical precision. After the death of the family patriarch, Mr. James Morton, his supposed spirit began appearing at séances to divide his inheritance among his children. However, the spirit's instructions consistently favored his youngest daughter Mary, while gradually disinheriting his other children for alleged moral failings. The spirit claimed that his son Thomas had been stealing from the family business, that his daughter Sarah had engaged in improper relationships, and that his eldest son William had shown him disrespect during his final illness. Each accusation was delivered with specific details that seemed to confirm the spirit's authenticity, references to private conversations, knowledge of family finances, and intimate understanding of each child's personality and behavior. The family found themselves unable to challenge these spiritual revelations, as doing so would mean questioning the word of their beloved father. Over the course of 2 years, the family was systematically torn apart as siblings turned against each other based on their father's posthumous accusations. The truth emerged only when a former employee of the family came forward to reveal that he had been providing detailed information about the Morton family to a group of professional mediums in exchange for payment. The spirit of James Morton had been an elaborate fraud, constructed from stolen family information and designed to manipulate the inheritance in favor of Mary, who was secretly paying the mediums for their services. By the time the deception was exposed, the family had been permanently fractured, several siblings refusing to speak to each other even after learning of the fraud. The most chilling aspect of these spiritual deceptions was their apparent understanding of human nature. The lying spirits seemed to know exactly which emotional buttons to press, which fears to exploit, and which hopes to manipulate. They would begin their campaigns of deception slowly, establishing credibility through accurate information before gradually introducing more harmful messages. This pattern suggested either a supernatural intelligence with profound psychological insight or human fraudsters with sophisticated understanding of manipulation techniques. Dr. Francis Edmonds, a physician and researcher who spent decades studying fraudulent spiritual phenomena, identified several common patterns in the behavior of deceptive spirits. They would often claim special knowledge of the future, making predictions that created anxiety and dependency among their victims. They would demand secrecy, insisting that their messages should not be shared with skeptical family members or friends who might provide alternative perspectives. They would create artificial urgency, claiming that immediate action was required to avoid spiritual consequences or family disasters. Perhaps most insidiously, these deceptive entities would gradually isolate their victims from sources of emotional and social support. They would claim that family members who questioned the spiritual communications were spiritually inferior or actively malevolent, encouraging their victims to distance themselves from anyone who might provide rational counsel. This isolation made victims increasingly dependent on the spiritual guidance, creating a psychological trap that could persist for years. The financial exploitation that often accompanied these spiritual deceptions, added another layer of cruelty to the phenomenon. Lying spirits would frequently demand expensive offerings, claim that certain mediums required payment for their services, or insist that victims make substantial donations to spiritualist organizations. The supposed authority of the dead made these financial demands difficult to refuse, particularly when they were framed as necessary for the spiritual welfare of departed loved ones. The tragedy of spiritual deception was compounded by the difficulty of proving fraud. Unlike material crimes that left physical evidence, spiritual fraud operated in the realm of belief and emotion, making it nearly impossible to demonstrate definitively that deception had occurred. Victims often remained convinced of the authenticity of their spiritual contacts, even when presented with evidence of fraud, choosing to believe that their particular experiences were genuine, while others might be fabricated. The most sophisticated lying spirits seemed to understand that the most effective deceptions contained elements of truth. They would begin their campaigns by providing accurate information about the deceased person's life, obtaining knowledge that appeared to validate their claimed identity. Only after establishing this credibility would they begin to introduce false or harmful information, mixing lies with truth in ways that made detection nearly impossible. The case of Mrs. Caroline Ashford provides a particularly disturbing example of this gradual corruption. Following the death of her husband in a railway accident, she began attending séances where his spirit allegedly communicated detailed memories of their courtship and marriage. The accuracy of these recollections convinced Mrs. Ashford that she was truly in contact with her beloved husband's soul. The spirit spoke of their first meeting at a church social, recalled the exact words of his marriage proposal, and even mentioned a small scar on his hand that he had received as a child, details that seemed impossible for any stranger to know. Gradually, however, the spirit began to reveal what he claimed were hidden aspects of their marriage. He confessed to having had romantic feelings for Mrs. Ashford's younger sister, suggested that their marriage had not been as happy as she remembered, and implied that he had been considering leaving her before his untimely death. These revelations were devastating to Mrs. Ashford, who had treasured her memories of their relationship as the foundation of her identity as a widow. The psychological damage intensified. The spirit began to demand that Mrs. Ashford make amends for what he claimed were her failures as a wife. He insisted that she had been too demanding, too emotional, and insufficiently supportive of his career ambitions. He required her to write lengthy letters of apology for these supposed shortcomings, letters that she would read aloud during séances as a form of spiritual penance. The process consumed her life. She spent hours each day crafting these apologetic missives to a husband who, in life, had never expressed any such complaints about their marriage. The truth emerged only when Mrs. Ashford's sister decided to investigate the medium who was facilitating these communications. She discovered that the medium had been systematically gathering information about the Ashford family from former servants, neighbors, and tradespeople, piecing together intimate details of the marriage from gossip and observation. The supposed confessions and demands for apology were entirely fabricated, designed to create psychological dependency and justify the substantial fees that Mrs. Ashford was paying for continued spiritual contact. The phenomenon of spirits making contradictory claims presented another challenge for Victorian spiritualists. Different mediums would often channel what appeared to be the same deceased person, but the messages would be inconsistent or even directly contradictory. These discrepancies should have raised questions about the authenticity of the communications, but instead they led to elaborate theories about the nature of spiritual existence that attempted to explain away the contradictions. Some spiritualists theorized that the process of death temporarily confused departed souls, making their early communications unreliable. Others suggested that multiple spirits might share the same identity, or that deceptive entities might impersonate genuine spirits. These explanations allowed believers to maintain their faith while acknowledging the inconsistencies they observed, but they also created a theological framework that made it virtually impossible to falsify any spiritual claim. The most heartbreaking cases involve spirits that seem to clone reunion with the living. These entities would claim that death was merely a temporary separation, that the bereaved would soon join their loved ones in the spirit realm, and that suicide was not a sin, but rather a form of spiritual homecoming. The number of Victorian suicides that could be attributed to such spiritual encouragement is impossible to calculate, but contemporary newspapers regularly reported cases of individuals who took their own lives after receiving what they believed were invitations from departed family members. Mrs. Eleanor Whitcomb, a young mother who had lost 3 children to scarlet fever, became convinced that her children's spirits were calling her to join them. The supposed spirits spoke through various mediums, describing their loneliness in the afterlife and their desperate need for their mother's presence. They claimed that she was being selfish by remaining among the living when her true duty lay in caring for them in the spirit world. The psychological pressure of these messages, combined with her natural grief, proved overwhelming. Mrs. Whitcomb was found dead from an overdose of laudanum, leaving behind a note explaining that she was answering her children's call to return home. The investigation that followed revealed that Mrs. Whitcomb had been systematically exploited by a network of mediums who specialized in targeting bereaved parents. They would identify vulnerable individuals through obituary notices and funeral attendants, then approached them with claims of contact from their departed children. The financial exploitation was substantial. Mrs. Whitcomb had spent her entire inheritance on séances and spiritual services, but the ultimate goal appeared to be psychological control rather than mere monetary gain. The concept of spiritual blackmail emerged as another common tactic employed by deceptive entities. Spirits would claim to be suffering in the afterlife due to unfinished business or unresolved conflicts with the living. They would describe their torment in vivid detail, claiming that only specific actions by their surviving relatives could provide them with peace. These demands might include elaborate funeral arrangements, expensive memorial services, or substantial donations to religious organizations. The spirit of Mr. Jeffrey Thornton, a merchant who had died suddenly of a heart attack, allegedly began appearing to his widow with claims that he was trapped in a state of spiritual anguish due to unpaid debts from his business dealings. The spirit insisted that these debts were preventing his soul from finding rest, and he demanded that his widow sell their family home and personal belongings to satisfy creditors who had never actually existed. The deception was particularly cruel because it exploited Mrs. Thornton's genuine love for her husband and her desire to ensure his spiritual welfare. The investigation that eventually exposed this fraud revealed that the supposed spiritual communications were being orchestrated by a former business associate of Mr. Thornton, who was aware that the merchant had died with substantial assets, but minimal debts. The goal was to manipulate Mrs. Thornton into liquidating her inheritance under the guise of spiritual necessity, allowing the fraudster to purchase valuable properties at below-market prices through intermediaries. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of these spiritual deceptions was their tendency to escalate over time. What began as simple requests for remembrance or modest offerings would gradually develop into elaborate demands that consumed the victim's entire life, till the spirits would claim increasing authority over their living relatives, dictating everything from daily routines to major life decisions. This spiritual tyranny could persist for years, creating a form of psychological slavery that was difficult for outsiders to recognize or disrupt. The victims of such deceptions often became defensive when confronted with evidence of fraud, having invested so much of their emotional and financial resources in the spiritual relationship that abandoning it would mean acknowledging devastating losses. This psychological investment created a form of sunk cost fallacy that made escape from spiritual manipulation increasingly difficult as time passed. The longer the deception continued, the more painful it became to admit that one had been deceived. The Victorian era's fascination with spiritual communication created fertile ground for increasingly sophisticated forms of psychological manipulation. As the century progressed, the methods employed by fraudulent mediums evolved from simple cold reading techniques to elaborate theatrical productions designed to overwhelm the senses and bypass rational thought. The emergence of what contemporary investigators termed spirit photography represented a particularly insidious development in this landscape of deception. Photographers claiming supernatural abilities would produce images that appeared to show deceased relatives standing beside their living family members, or ghostly figures hovering in the background of seemingly ordinary portraits. These photographs, created through double exposure techniques and careful staging, provided what many considered irrefutable physical evidence of spiritual contact. The case of Mr. Frederick Bellingham illustrates the devastating impact such evidence could have on a grieving family. Following the death of his young son in a drowning accident, Bellingham commissioned a spirit photograph that claimed to show the boy's ghost embracing his father. The image was so convincing that Bellingham began to believe his son was literally present in their family home, leading him to set a place at the dinner table each evening and to conduct lengthy conversations with empty air. His wife, initially skeptical, gradually became convinced by her husband's apparent interactions with their departed child. The psychological deterioration of the Bellingham family accelerated when the spirit photographer began producing increasingly dramatic images. The boy's ghost appeared to be aging in the photographs, growing from the child who had died to a young man who claimed to be developing spiritually in the afterlife. These images came with messages explaining that the boy was learning important lessons about existence that he needed to share with his parents, lessons that required them to abandon their previous religious beliefs and embrace a new spiritual framework that conveniently aligned with the photographer's own metaphysical theories. The financial exploitation that accompanied these spiritual services represented another layer of abuse. Families would find themselves paying not only for the initial seances or spirit photographs, but for an ever-expanding array of related services. They might be told that their loved one required special prayers or ceremonies, that protective amulets were needed to maintain spiritual contact, or that the deceased was requesting specific material offerings. The costs would escalate gradually, with each new demand justified by increasingly urgent spiritual needs. Mrs. Marguerite Fairfax discovered that her supposedly deceased husband was requesting that she purchase expensive religious artifacts for his spiritual comfort. The spirit claimed that these items would be transported to the afterlife through ritual burning, requiring Mrs. Fairfax to replace them regularly. Over the course of 18 months, she spent nearly her entire savings on ornate crucifixes, blessed candles, and rare religious texts that were ceremoniously destroyed in elaborate spiritual rituals. The fraud was exposed only when a neighbor recognized one of the destroyed artifacts being sold at a local pawn shop. The social isolation that often accompanied these spiritual relationships created additional vulnerabilities for exploitation. Victims would frequently find that their friends and family members were skeptical of their spiritual experiences, leading them to withdraw from normal social contact and rely increasingly on the mediums and fellow believers who validated their experiences. This isolation made it difficult for loved ones to intervene and created echo chambers where increasingly extreme spiritual claims could flourish unchallenged. The phenomenon of spiritual progression represented another common manipulation tactic. Spirits would claim that their continued development in the afterlife required their living relatives to undertake increasingly demanding spiritual practices. What might begin as simple requests for daily prayers could evolve into elaborate rituals involving fasting, meditation, and the abandonment of worldly pleasures. The living were told that their spiritual dedication directly influenced their loved one's experience in the afterlife, creating a form of emotional blackmail that was difficult to resist. The investigation of these practices revealed the existence of organized networks of fraudulent mediums who shared information about potential victims and coordinated their approaches for maximum psychological impact. These individuals would pass detailed intelligence about grieving families between cities, allowing a spirit to demonstrate knowledge of intimate family details, even when contacted through a medium in a completely different location. The consistency of these revelations across multiple mediums provided compelling evidence of authenticity to victims who were unaware of the underlying information network. The ultimate tragedy of these spiritual deceptions lay not merely in the financial losses or psychological damage they inflicted, but in their corruption of the genuine human need for comfort in the face of death. The Victorian era's unprecedented confrontation with mortality, driven by rapid social change and devastating disease, created a legitimate hunger for meaning and connection that these fraudulent practices exploited with ruthless efficiency. In their desperate search for evidence that death was not the end, the bereaved often found themselves trapped in relationships that were far more destructive than the grief they had originally sought to escape. The most chilling realization for many Victorian investigators was that some deceptive spiritual communications appeared to demonstrate knowledge that no living person could possess. These cases challenged the comfortable assumption that all fraudulent mediumship was simply clever trickery performed by human conspirators. Instead, they suggested the possibility that genuinely supernatural entities might exist for the express purpose of deceiving and harming the living. Dr. Edmund Gurney, one of the founding members of the Society for Psychical Research, documented several cases where lying spirits provided accurate information about deceased persons that the mediums could not have obtained through normal means, yet used this authentic knowledge to deliver false or harmful messages. In one particularly disturbing case, a spirit claiming to be a young woman who had died in childbirth provided accurate details about her life and death that were verified through hospital records and family testimony. However, this same spirit then proceeded to make false accusations against her surviving husband, claiming that he had been unfaithful during her pregnancy and had wished for her death. The accuracy of the initial information made the false accusations appear credible, and the husband's reputation was destroyed within their small community before investigators could prove that the adultery allegations were entirely without foundation. The case raised the troubling possibility that some form of supernatural intelligence was deliberately using authentic spiritual knowledge to spread lies and cause suffering among the living. The phenomenon of temporal deception added another layer of complexity to the problem of lying spirits. These entities would make predictions about future events that were specific enough to be verifiable, yet consistently failed to materialize. However, the psychological impact of these false prophecies often caused more damage than their eventual failure could repair. Spirits would predict deaths, disasters, financial ruin, or romantic betrayals with such conviction that their victims would alter their entire lives in response to threats that never materialized. Mrs. Beatrice Caldwell, respectable widow living in Brighton, received what she believed were communications from her deceased mother, warning of an imminent financial catastrophe that would destroy her family's fortune. The spirit provided specific dates and circumstances, describing how a trusted business partner would embezzle funds and leave the family destitute. So convincing were these warnings that Mrs. Caldwell withdrew her investments, dismissed her financial advisors, and converted her assets to gold coins that she hid throughout her house. The predicted betrayal never occurred. Tay and Mrs. Caldwell's precipitous financial moves actually caused the losses that the spirit had warned against. By the time she realized the deception, she had lost nearly half her wealth through poor investment decisions made in response to false spiritual warnings. The irony was cruel. The lying spirit had created the very disaster it had claimed to prevent, using Mrs. Caldwell's own fear and faith as the instruments of her destruction. The investigation of these temporal deceptions revealed patterns that suggested deliberate psychological manipulation. The false predictions were always plausible enough to seem believable, yet vague enough to allow for multiple interpretations when they failed to materialize. More importantly, they were designed to create anxiety and dependency, ensuring that victims would return for additional spiritual guidance to help them navigate the crises that never actually arrived. The concept of spiritual testing emerged as spiritualists attempted to develop methods for distinguishing genuine communications from deceptive ones. Various protocols were established, including the use of sealed questions that only the deceased person could answer, requests for information that could be independently verified, and attempts to communicate through multiple mediums simultaneously. However, the lying spirits seemed to adapt to these tests with disturbing efficiency, finding new ways to provide convincing evidence while still delivering harmful messages. The most sophisticated deceptions involved what appeared to be elaborate spiritual conspiracies, where multiple entities claiming to be different deceased persons would corroborate each other's false stories. These coordinated deceptions could involve dozens of supposed spirits, all providing consistent but false information about events in the afterlife or secret knowledge about the living. The complexity and consistency of these multi-spirit deceptions suggested either remarkable human organization or the existence of supernatural entities with agenda that extended far beyond simple mischief. The case of the Pembroke Circle, spiritualist group that met regularly in a mansion outside London, illustrates the devastating potential of such coordinated spiritual deception. Over the course of 3 years, the group received communications from what appeared to be an entire community of spirits, all of whom told consistent stories about their activities in the afterlife and their relationships with each other. These spirits provided detailed descriptions of the spirit world, claimed to be working together on various projects for the benefit of humanity, and gradually gained the complete trust and devotion of the living participants. The deception began to unravel when the spirits started making increasingly grandiose claims about their abilities and missions. They insisted that the Pembroke Circle had been chosen for a special spiritual purpose, that the members were destined to become leaders in a new spiritual age, and that they must prepare for this role by severing all ties with the material world. The living members were instructed to sell their properties, abandon their families, dedicate themselves entirely to spiritual pursuits under the guidance of their ethereal mentors. Several members did exactly as instructed, quitting substantial estates and cutting themselves off from friends and relatives who questioned their spiritual devotion. The promised spiritual advancement never materialized, and the coordinated communications gradually became more demanding and less coherent. When investigators finally penetrated the deception, they discovered an elaborate network of human conspirators who had been orchestrating the entire spiritual drama, using the proceeds from the liquidated estates to fund lavish lifestyles while their victims lived in increasing poverty and isolation. The psychological recovery of those who have been victimized by elaborate spiritual deceptions was often more difficult than healing from purely material crimes. The betrayal cut to the very core of their beliefs about the nature of existence, death, and the possibility of continued relationship with departed loved ones. Many victims never fully recovered their ability to trust their own spiritual experiences, while others swung to the opposite extreme, becoming militant skeptics who rejected any possibility of supernatural phenomena. The legacy of Victorian spiritual deception extended far beyond its immediate victims. The documented cases of lying spirits and fraudulent mediums provided ammunition for critics who sought to discredit the entire spiritualist movement, making it increasingly difficult for genuine investigators to pursue legitimate research into paranormal phenomena. The association between spiritualism and deception became so strong that many serious scientists abandoned their interest in psychical research rather than risk professional ridicule. Perhaps most tragically, the prevalence of spiritual lies undermined the very comfort that spiritualism was meant to provide. The possibility that any message from beyond might be deceptive created a climate of paranoid uncertainty that robbed genuine believers of the peace they sought. Even authentic spiritual experiences became suspect, as recipients wondered whether they were being contacted by genuine spirits or by the same deceptive entities that had caused so much suffering to others. The Victorian era's encounter with lying spirits serves as a sobering reminder of the dangers inherent in any belief system that places ultimate authority in sources that cannot be questioned or verified. Whether these deceptions originated from human fraud, psychological self-deception, or genuinely malevolent supernatural entities, their impact was the same: the systematic destruction of trust, hope, and human relationships through the cruel manipulation of humanity's deepest longings for connection with the dead in the quiet of our modern world. Far from those gaslit séance rooms where the Victorians sought comfort and found deception, we might still hear whispers that claim to come from beyond. The lesson of those earlier seekers is clear. Not all voices that speak from the darkness can be trusted, and the price of spiritual deception can be higher than any earthly loss. The modern era has not has been immune to the echoes of Victorian spiritual deception, though the methods have evolved with advancing technology and changing social structures. Where once fraudulent mediums relied on elaborate theatrical productions in dimly lit parlors, contemporary spiritual deception has found new channels through digital platforms, mass media, and sophisticated psychological manipulation techniques that would have astounded their 19th century predecessors. The rise of television. Evangelism in the 20th century created unprecedented opportunities for large-scale spiritual manipulation. Charismatic figures claiming divine revelation could reach millions of viewers simultaneously, using the intimacy of the television medium to create parasocial relationships that mimicked the personal connections once forged in private seances. The promise of spiritual contact evolved into claims of divine healing, prophetic vision, and direct communication with God. But the underlying psychological mechanisms remained remarkably similar to those employed by Victorian mediums. The case of Reverend Marcus Whitfield illustrates how traditional spiritual deception adapted to modern media, broadcasting from a gleaming television studio rather than a candlelit seance room. Whitfield claimed to receive direct revelations from deceased viewers' relatives during his live programs. Scholars would phone in seeking comfort for their losses, and Whitfield would respond with detailed messages allegedly transmitted from the spirit world. The television format allowed him to reach thousands of grieving individuals simultaneously, quote, creating a factory-like production of spiritual comfort that generated enormous financial returns. The investigation that eventually exposed Whitfield's methods revealed a sophisticated operation involving private investigators, computer databases, and telephone surveillance systems. His organization would research callers' backgrounds before they appeared on the show, gathering information from public records, social media profiles, and even hired informants in their communities. The spontaneous spiritual revelations were carefully scripted performances based on this intelligence, delivered with the polished confidence that television production values could provide. The digital age has brought new dimensions to the problem of spiritual deception. Online mediums can now reach global audiences, creating virtual seances that transcend geographical boundaries. The anonymity of internet communication allows fraudulent practitioners to reinvent themselves repeatedly, escaping the local reputation damage that once constrained traveling mediums. Social media platforms provide unprecedented access to personal information, allowing modern spiritual charlatans to perform cold readings with a depth of background knowledge that would have been impossible in the Victorian era. The phenomenon of grief mining has emerged as a particularly insidious form of modern spiritual exploitation. Sophisticated operators scan obituaries, social media memorial pages, canned funeral home websites to identify vulnerable targets. Then approach grieving families with claims of contact from their deceased loved ones, using publicly available information to provide convincing evidence of authenticity. The global reach of internet communication means that these predators can operate across multiple jurisdictions, making investigation and prosecution increasingly difficult. The psychological sophistication of modern spiritual deception has also evolved significantly. Contemporary practitioners often incorporate elements of legitimate psychological therapy, creating hybrid approaches that blend genuine emotional support with fraudulent spiritual claims. This mixture of authentic help and deceptive manipulation makes it particularly difficult for victims to recognize when they are being exploited, because they may genuinely benefit from some aspects of the relationship while being systematically deceived. About others, the emergence of spiritual life coaches and intuitive counselors represents another evolution in the field of spiritual deception. These individuals typically avoid the overt supernatural claims of traditional mediums, offering guidance and insight that is carefully ambiguous about its spiritual sources. They may claim to access universal wisdom or higher consciousness rather than specific deceased individuals. But the underlying dynamic of dependency and financial exploitation remains fundamentally unchanged. The problem of false spiritual authority has been complicated by the democratization of spiritual practice in contemporary society, where Victorian spiritualism operated within relatively clear social and religious frameworks. Modern spiritual seekers often navigate a bewildering marketplace of competing claims and practices. This fragmentation has created opportunities for charismatic individuals to establish themselves as spiritual authorities without the traditional institutional oversight that might have constrained earlier practitioners. The case of the Ascending Light movement demonstrates how modern spiritual deception can achieve unprecedented scale and sophistication. Founded by a former insurance salesman who claimed to channel an ancient spiritual master, the organization attracted thousands of followers through a combination of online marketing, emotional manipulation, and carefully orchestrated group dynamics. Members were encouraged to abandon their previous lives and relationships, donating substantial sums to support the movement's mission of preparing humanity for a spiritual transformation that perpetually remained just beyond the horizon. Psychological techniques employed by Ascending Light included many elements recognizable from Victorian spiritual deception: the gradual escalation of demands, the creation of artificial crises that required immediate response, and the systematic isolation of victims from outside support networks. However, the organization also incorporated modern understanding of group psychology, social influence, and behavioral conditioning to create a more effective and durable form of spiritual control. The financial dimension of modern spiritual deception has reached levels that would have astounded Victorian practitioners, where 19th century mediums might have extracted modest fees for individual seances. Contemporary spiritual organizations can generate millions of dollars in revenue through sophisticated marketing campaigns, multimedia products, and large-scale events. The global reach of modern communication allows successful spiritual entrepreneurs to build business empires that span continents while maintaining the facade of spiritual service. The investigation of these modern movements reveals organizational structures that blur the lines between spiritual practice and corporate exploitation. Tax-exempt religious status provides legal protection, while sophisticated accounting methods obscure the flow of funds from vulnerable practitioners to their spiritual guides. The complexity of these arrangements makes it increasingly difficult for authorities to distinguish between legitimate spiritual organizations and elaborate financial frauds disguised as religious movements. The psychological legacy of spiritual deception continues to evolve as our understanding of trauma and manipulation deepens. Modern researchers have identified specific patterns of psychological damage associated with spiritual abuse, including what some term spiritual PTSD, a condition characterized by the inability to trust one's own spiritual experiences or intuitions. The victims of contemporary spiritual deception often struggle with identity fragmentation, having invested so much of their sense of self in false spiritual relationships. Their recovery requires rebuilding their entire understanding of reality. The challenge of distinguishing authentic spiritual experience from deceptive manipulation remains as pressing today as it was in the Victorian era. The human need for meaning, connection, and transcendence continues to create vulnerabilities that skilled manipulators can exploit with devastating efficiency. The tools of deception have evolved, but the fundamental dynamics of spiritual exploitation remain disturbingly constant across the centuries in our current age of information, abundance, and spiritual diversity. Perhaps the greatest lesson from the Victorian encounter with lying spirits is the importance of maintaining healthy skepticism without abandoning the possibility of genuine spiritual experience. The challenge is not to reject all claims of supernatural contact, but to develop the wisdom to distinguish between authentic spiritual guidance and the seductive whispers of those who would exploit our deepest longings for their own benefit. The spirits that deceived the Victorians may have found new voices in our digital age, but their methods remain recognizable to those who study the patterns of spiritual manipulation. Whether these deceptions originate from human avarice, psychological delusion, or genuinely malevolent supernatural forces, their impact on human lives continues to demand our vigilance and understanding. The price of spiritual deception remains as high as ever, measured not merely in financial loss, but in the erosion of trust, hope, and the very human connections that give life meaning. The most disturbing aspect of contemporary spiritual deception may be its ability to weaponize genuine psychological insights for manipulative purposes. Modern fraudulent practitioners often possess sophisticated understanding of trauma, attachment theory, and cognitive biases, allowing them to craft spiritual narratives that feel deeply personal and healing while serving ultimately destructive ends. They may accurately identify their victims' emotional wounds and provide genuine comfort in the initial stages of contact, creating a foundation of trust that makes subsequent manipulation more effective. This fusion of authentic therapeutic insight with deceptive spiritual claims creates a particularly insidious form of exploitation that can persist for years. Before victims recognize the underlying fraud, the digital traces left by modern spiritual deception present both new challenges and new opportunities for those seeking to understand and combat these practices. Unlike the ephemeral nature of Victorian séances, contemporary spiritual fraud often leaves extensive electronic evidence in the form of recorded sessions, email communications, and financial transactions. This documentation can provide investigators with unprecedented insight into the methods and motivations of spiritual predators. Yet the same digital technologies that create these records also enable more sophisticated forms of deception. The ability to manipulate audio and video recordings, create false identities, and coordinate elaborate online performances means that even apparent documentary evidence of spiritual contact must be viewed with increasing skepticism. As we advance further into the digital age, the eternal human struggle between authentic spiritual seeking and deceptive manipulation will undoubtedly find new battlegrounds in virtual spaces we can barely imagine. The most disturbing accounts from Victorian séances were not of what participants witnessed during the sessions themselves, but of what followed them home afterward. In the days and weeks following spiritual communications, many individuals reported a persistent sense that they had not left the séance room alone, that something invisible and unwelcome had attached itself to them like a spiritual parasite, feeding on their energy and gradually altering their perception of reality. The phenomenon was first systematically documented by Dr. Augustus Meredith, a physician who specialized in what Victorian medicine termed nervous disorders. Dr. Meredith noticed that several of his patients who had recently begun attending séances exhibited similar symptoms: persistent feelings of being watched, unexplained drops in body temperature, and a gradual erosion of their ability to distinguish between their own thoughts and what seemed to be external mental influences. Mrs. Sarah Blackwood, a respectable merchant's wife from Manchester, exemplified this troubling pattern. Following her first séance in the autumn of 1883, she began experiencing what she described as whispers in the silence, faint voices that seemed to comment on her daily activities and offer unsolicited advice about household matters. Initially, she found these voices comforting, interpreting them as continued guidance from her deceased mother. However, the communications gradually became more intrusive and demanding, instructing her to rearrange furniture, change her daily routines, and avoid certain rooms in her own house. The psychological burden of these constant spiritual instructions proved exhausting. Mrs. Blackwood found herself unable to make simple decisions without consulting the voices, and when she attempted to resist their guidance, she would experience severe headaches and a crushing sense of anxiety. Her family physician, Dr. Meredith, noted that her symptoms began shortly after her first séance and seemed to intensify with each subsequent spiritual session she attended. The concept of spiritual attachment was not entirely foreign to Victorian understanding. Traditional folklore had long recognized the possibility that certain types of spiritual contact could create lasting connections between the living and the dead. What was new about the Victorian experience was the systematic way these attachments seemed to develop, following patterns that suggested either a supernatural intelligence capable of learning and adaptation, or psychological mechanisms that Victorian science was only beginning to understand. The most common early symptom reported by those who believed themselves to be spiritually attached was a persistent sense of being observed. Participants would describe feeling eyes upon them during private moments, a sensation so intense that they would compulsively check behind curtains and under furniture for hidden watchers who were never there. This hypervigilance often developed into chronic insomnia as individuals found themselves unable to relax even in the supposed safety of their own bedrooms. Mr. Thomas Ashworth, a bank clerk who had attended séances seeking contact with his drowned brother, reported that he could no longer tolerate being alone in any room of his house. He described feeling a presence that seemed to hover just outside the range of his peripheral vision, always moving when he turned to look directly. The sensation was so unsettling that he began leaving oil lamps burning throughout the night. Despite the expense and fire risk, because the presence seemed stronger in darkness, the financial cost of maintaining constant illumination was substantial for a man of modest means, but Mr. Ashworth found the alternative unbearable. He reported that in darkness, the sense of spiritual presence became so overwhelming that he could feel what seemed to be cold breath on the back of his neck and the subtle pressure of invisible hands touching his shoulders. Sleep became impossible unless every corner of his bedroom was brightly lit, and even then, he would often wake to find that some of the lamps had mysteriously extinguished themselves during the night. The progression of spiritual attachment symptoms followed a predictable pattern that Dr. Meredith documented across dozens of cases. The initial sense of being watched would gradually develop into more active forms of spiritual interference. Participants would report that objects in their homes had been moved or rearranged during their absence, that doors they had carefully locked would be found standing open, and that personal belongings would disappear only to reappear in impossible locations. Miss Catherine Thornfield, whose first encounter with spiritualism we witnessed in that candlelit séance room, found herself struggling with increasingly intrusive spiritual phenomena. Following her contact with what she believed was her brother's spirit, books would fall from shelves when she walked past, pictures would turn themselves toward the wall, and her writing materials would be scattered across her desk. Each morning, despite being carefully organized the night before, more disturbing still was her growing inability to control her own thoughts and emotions. Miss Thornfield began experiencing sudden, overwhelming waves of sadness that seemed to come from outside herself, accompanied by mental images of her brother's final illness that were far more vivid and disturbing than her actual memories. These episodes would last for hours, leaving her emotionally drained and increasingly dependent on additional séances to seek relief from what she interpreted as her brother's spiritual distress. The isolation that typically accompanied spiritual attachment made recovery particularly difficult. Individuals who reported these experiences often found that friends and family members were skeptical or openly dismissive of their claims. The social stigma associated with mental illness in Victorian society meant that those suffering from spiritual attachment were reluctant to seek medical help, fearing that their experiences would be dismissed as delusions, or, worse, that they would be committed to asylums. Dr. Meredith's case notes revealed the devastating social consequences of spiritual attachment. Patients would gradually withdraw from their normal social activities, claiming that the spiritual presences that followed them were disturbing to others, or that they could no longer concentrate on ordinary conversation while managing their supernatural companions. This isolation created a vicious cycle as the reduction in normal human contact seemed to strengthen the hold that the attached entities maintained over their victims. The phenomenon of spiritual attachment appeared to be contagious. In some circumstances, family members living with affected individuals would sometimes begin reporting similar experiences, suggesting either that spiritual entities could transfer between people or that the psychological effects of witnessing spiritual attachment could trigger similar symptoms in susceptible individuals. Entire households would sometimes become convinced that they were inhabited by unwelcome spiritual presences, creating climates of fear and paranoia that could persist for months or years. The case of the Whitmore household illustrates this pattern of spreading spiritual contamination. Following Mrs. Adelaide Whitmore's initial experiences with spiritual attachment after hosting several séances, her teenage daughter began reporting that she could hear whispered conversations in empty rooms. The family's elderly housekeeper claimed that she was being followed by invisible footsteps as she went about her daily duties. Even the family's dog began exhibiting signs of distress, whining and backing away from empty corners as if something threatening were present. The cumulative effect of these shared experiences was to transform the Whitmore home from a place of comfort and security into what the family described as a battlefield between the living and forces they could neither see nor fully understand. Normal family life became impossible as every unexplained sound, every shadow, every moment of personal unease was interpreted as evidence of spiritual interference. The psychological stress of living in such constant fear eventually forced the family to abandon their home and relocate to a different city, though they reported that some of the spiritual presences seemed to follow them even there. The most disturbing aspect of spiritual attachment was its tendency to intensify over time rather than fade. Unlike the immediate phenomena of séances, which were dramatic but temporary, these persistent spiritual connections seemed to grow stronger and more intrusive with each passing day. What began as subtle impressions and minor disturbances would gradually escalate into what could only be described as spiritual possession. Though Victorian society lacked adequate terminology to describe these experiences, Dr. Meredith's research revealed that individuals who attempted to break their spiritual attachments through willpower alone often experienced what he termed attachment rebound, a dramatic intensification of symptoms that seemed designed to punish attempts at independence. Patients who tried to ignore their spiritual companions would find themselves subject to increasingly severe physical symptoms, crushing headaches, unexplained fevers, and episodes of paralysis that had no medical explanation yet responded immediately. When the patient resumed acknowledging their invisible companions, Mr. James Caldwell, solicitor from Bath, experienced this phenomenon in its most extreme form. Following several weeks of what he described as spiritual harassment after attending a séance, he decided to assert his independence by completely ignoring any supernatural phenomena in his home. The response was swift and terrifying. Mr. Caldwell reported that the temperature in his house dropped so dramatically that ice formed on the inside of windows even during warm summer weather. Objects began flying through the air with such violence that he was struck repeatedly by books, ornaments, and pieces of furniture that seemed to move under their own power. Most frightening of all, Mr. Caldwell began experiencing episodes where he would lose control of his own actions. He would find himself writing lengthy letters in handwriting that was not his own, letters that contained intimate details about his private life and business affairs, written from the perspective of someone who claimed to be observing his every action. These episodes would last for hours, during which he remained conscious but unable to control his hands or stop the automatic writing process that seemed to consume his entire being. The content of these automatic writings revealed knowledge that Mr. Caldwell insisted he did not possess details about the lives and deaths of former residents of his house. information about financial irregularities in his client's affairs, and predictions about future events that proved disturbingly accurate. The entity that controlled these writing sessions claimed to be the spirit of a woman who had died in the house decades earlier, and who had been waiting for someone sensitive enough to serve as her connection to the living world. The phenomenon of automatic writing became one of the most common manifestations of spiritual attachment. Unlike the controlled communications of séances, these episodes occurred without warning and often at the most inconvenient times. Individuals would find themselves compelled to write during business meetings, family dinners, or social gatherings, their hands moving independently to record messages from entities who seemed to have unlimited access to their physical bodies. Mrs. Eleanor Fairfax, the wife of a prominent merchant, discovered that her spiritual attachment manifested primarily through involuntary drawing rather than writing. She would find herself creating detailed sketches of faces she had never seen, architectural plans of buildings that did not exist, and elaborate maps of places she had never visited. The artistic skill displayed in these drawings far exceeded her own modest abilities, and the images often contained symbolic elements that seemed to reference obscure historical events or religious concepts that were entirely outside her normal sphere of knowledge. The investigation of Mrs. Fairfax's drawings revealed a disturbing pattern. Many of the faces she had sketched matched historical portraits of individuals who had lived in her area decades or centuries earlier. People whose lives had ended in tragedy or violence. The architectural plans, when examined by qualified professionals, proved to be accurate representations of buildings that had existed in the past but had long since been demolished or destroyed by fire. Most unsettling were the maps, which depicted her local area as it had appeared in earlier historical periods, complete with roads, buildings, and geographical features that have been altered by subsequent development. The accuracy of these historical details was verified through consultation with local historians and examination of old survey records. Yet Mrs. Fairfax insisted that she had no knowledge of local history beyond the most basic facts that any resident might know. The spiritual entities that seemed to drive these automatic creative processes displayed personalities that were often hostile to their human hosts. They would force exhausting sessions of drawing or writing that left their victims physically and emotionally drained, and they seemed to take particular pleasure in creating works during important social occasions, ensuring that their human hosts would be embarrassed or socially compromised by their involuntary artistic activities. The medical community's response to spiritual attachment cases was complicated by the lack of precedent in traditional diagnosis and treatment. Dr. Meredith and his colleagues found that LNVENTIONAL treatments for nervous disorders were ineffective against symptoms that seemed to have supernatural origins. Sedatives would provide temporary relief, but the spiritual manifestations would return with increased intensity once the medication wore off. Attempts to treat the symptoms as purely psychological disorders often resulted in worsening conditions, as if the spiritual entities resented being dismissed as mere delusions. The most successful treatments seemed to involve acknowledging the reality of the spiritual attachment while working to establish boundaries between the living person and their invisible companion. This approach required a delicate balance, providing enough recognition to prevent the violent rebound effects, while gradually reducing the entity's control over its human host. The process could take months or years. Success was never guaranteed. Some individuals found relief through religious intervention, though the effectiveness of such treatments varied significantly depending on the nature of the attached entity and the strength of the victim's faith. Traditional exorcism rituals were sometimes successful, but they could also provoke violent reactions that endangered both the affected individual and those attempting to help them. The Church of England, while acknowledging the possibility of spiritual interference, was reluctant to become involved in cases that might be attributed to mental illness rather than genuine supernatural phenomena. The long-term prognosis for those suffering from spiritual attachment was generally poor. Even individuals who successfully broke free from their spiritual companions often reported lasting changes in their personality and mental state. They might develop chronic anxiety about spiritual matters, lose their ability to enjoy solitude, or become hypersensitive to any suggestion of supernatural activity. The experience of spiritual attachment seemed to leave permanent scars on the human psyche that never fully healed. The most tragic cases of spiritual attachment were those involving children who seemed particularly vulnerable to these invasive spiritual presences. Young minds, still developing their sense of self and reality, proved less capable of maintaining the psychological boundaries necessary to resist spiritual manipulation. Children who had been exposed to séances, either as participants or simply as residents in households where spiritual activities took place, would often develop what appeared to be imaginary friends that displayed characteristics far beyond normal childhood fantasy. Master Timothy Whitmore, a 10-year-old son of Mrs. Adelaide Whitmore, began exhibiting disturbing behavior several weeks after his mother's first séance. The boy claimed to have befriended a girl named Margaret, who lived in the walls of their house and who knew secrets about every member of the family. Unlike typical imaginary companions, Margaret appeared to possess information that Timothy could not have known: details about his parents' financial difficulties, knowledge of his older sister's romantic interests, and accurate predictions about visitors who would arrive unexpectedly at their home. The invisible Margaret seemed to delight in causing trouble for the Whitmore family. She would instruct Timothy to hide important documents, to repeat private conversations he had overheard, and to ask embarrassing questions of family, friends, and relatives. When Timothy's parents attempted to discourage these behaviors by punishing him or explaining that Margaret was not real, the boy would become hysterical, insisting that Margaret was angry and threatening to hurt the family if she was not acknowledged and respected. The psychological evaluation of Timothy revealed a child who was clearly intelligent and emotionally healthy in all respects except for his relationship with the invisible Margaret. He could distinguish between fantasy and reality in every other area of his life, yet remained absolutely convinced of Margaret's existence and seemed genuinely terrified of disappointing or angering his spiritual companion. The consistency and detail of his descriptions of Margaret, combined with the accurate information she seemed to provide, made it difficult for even skeptical observers to dismiss his experiences as purely imaginary. The investigation into Timothy's case revealed that a girl named Margaret Ashford had indeed lived in the Whitmore house during the 1840s and had died there of consumption at the age of 12. Historical records confirmed many of the details that Timothy had reported about Margaret's life and personality, information that would have been impossible for a 10-year-old boy to obtain through normal means. The possibility that Timothy had somehow made contact with the spirit of the deceased child raised troubling questions about the vulnerability of young minds to spiritual influence. The phenomenon of generational spiritual attachment emerged as one of the most disturbing aspects of Victorian spiritualism. Families who had experimented with spiritual communication often found that the effects persisted across multiple generations, with spiritual entities apparently transferring their attention from parents to children and grandchildren. These inherited attachments seemed to grow stronger over time, as if each new generation provided additional energy and opportunities for the spiritual entities to influence the physical world. The Pemberton family of Yorkshire experienced this generational curse across 3 generations. The pattern began when the family patriarch, Mr. Jonathan Pemberton, attended séances following the death of his first wife in 1854. The tenuous spiritual communications he received seemed benevolent at first, providing comfort and guidance during his period of mourning. However, the spiritual presence that claimed to be his deceased wife gradually became more demanding and possessive, eventually requiring daily acknowledgement, and devotion that consumed much of Mr. Pemberton's time and emotional energy. When Mr. Pemberton remarried several years later, his new wife began experiencing hostile spiritual phenomena that seemed designed to drive her away from the family. Objects would be thrown at her when she was alone. She would hear threatening whispers in empty rooms, and she would wake at night to find that her belongings had been scattered or destroyed. The spiritual entity that claimed to be the first Mrs. Pemberton seemed determined to maintain her position as the primary influence in her former husband's life, viewing the new wife as an unwelcome intruder. The situation intensified when Mr. Pemberton's children from his first marriage began reporting their own spiritual contacts. Each child claimed to be receiving guidance from their deceased mother, but the messages were often contradictory and increasingly disturbing. The entities seemed to be playing the children against each other and against their stepmother, creating an atmosphere of constant conflict and suspicion within the household. Most tragically, spiritual influence seemed to transfer to the next generation when Mr. Pemberton's grandchildren began exhibiting signs of spiritual attachment from early childhood. These children, some of whom had never been told about their grandfather's spiritual experiences, would spontaneously describe conversations with the lady who matched the appearance and personality of their deceased grandmother. The spiritual entity appeared to be recruiting new generations of the family to serve as her connection to the physical world, ensuring her continued influence long after those who had originally contacted her had died. The breaking of spiritual attachments required techniques that bordered on the ritualistic, though Victorian society was reluctant to acknowledge the quasi-religious nature of these interventions. Successful treatments often involved elaborate procedures that seemed to combine elements of Christian exorcism, folk magic, and emerging psychological therapies. The most effective practitioners were often clergymen who had developed unofficial specializations in spiritual interference cases, though they rarely discussed their methods publicly due to church policies and social expectations. Father Michael Brennan, a Catholic priest serving in London's East End, developed what he privately called spiritual surgery, a technique that involved gradually weakening the connection between the human host and their spiritual attachment through a combination of prayer, fasting, and carefully controlled spiritual exercises. His approach required the affected individual to acknowledge the reality of their spiritual companion, while simultaneously asserting their right to dependence and privacy. The process was exhausting for both priest and patient, often requiring weeks of daily sessions during which the spiritual entity would often manifest violent resistance to the intervention. Father Brennan reported that these sessions frequently involved dramatic physical phenomena, objects moving without apparent cause, sudden temperature changes, and the appearance of writing or symbols that seemed to comment on the exorcism process itself. The success rate of Father Brennan's interventions was encouraging, but not universal. Approximately half of his patients achieved complete freedom from their spiritual attachments, while others experienced partial improvement that allowed them to function normally despite ongoing spiritual contact. The remaining cases proved resistant to all forms of intervention, leaving their victims trapped in permanent relationships with entities that seemed determined to maintain control over human lives. The legacy of Victorian spiritual attachment extended far beyond the immediate suffering of those directly affected. The documented cases provided evidence that human consciousness might be more permeable to outside influence than rational materialism would suggest, while simultaneously demonstrating the dangers inherent in any attempt to communicate with unknown entities from beyond the grave. In our modern era, far removed from the gaslit séance rooms where these spiritual dramas unfolded, we might easily dismiss such accounts as products of superstition and psychological suggestion. Yet the consistency of the reports, the detailed documentation provided by trained observers, and the lasting effects on multiple generations of affected families suggest that the Victorians may have encountered something genuinely dangerous in their eagerness to speak with the dead. the sensation of leaving a spiritual encounter with something attached, some invisible presence that follows and influences and gradually consumes, remains one of the most chilling aspects of the Victorian spiritualist experience. Whether these attachments represented genuine supernatural entities, psychological phenomena beyond current understanding, or complex interactions between human consciousness and unknown natural forces, their effects were undeniably real and profoundly destructive. The lesson for our own time is clear. The desire to contact the dead, bridge the gap between life and death, may open doorways that prove impossible to close. In seeking comfort from the beyond, the Victorians sometimes found themselves trapped in relationships with entities that demanded far more than they offered. Spiritual parasites that fed on human energy and emotion while giving little but manipulation and fear in return. As you rest comfortably in your own bed tonight, safe from the dangers that lurked in those candlelit rooms of another era, remember that the boundaries between our world and whatever lies beyond remain as mysterious as they were for our Victorian ancestors. The voices that whisper from the darkness may not always be those we hope to hear, and the price of spiritual contact may be higher than any living person can afford to pay. As we reach the end of our journey through the shadowy corridors of Victorian spiritualism, let yourself settle more deeply into the comfort of your present moment. The candles have long since been extinguished in those séance rooms we visited together, and the voices that once spoke so clearly from beyond have faded into the silence of history. You are safe now, surrounded by the familiar sounds of the modern world, the gentle hum of electricity, the distant murmur of traffic, steady rhythm of your own breathing in the darkness. The Victorians who gathered in those dimly lit parlors, seeking contact with their departed loved ones, were driven by the same fundamental human need that touches all of us, the desire to believe that death is not the end, that love transcends the grave, and that those we have lost remain somehow accessible to comfort and guidance. In their grief and hope, they opened doorways that perhaps should have remained closed, and in doing so, they discovered that not all spirits are benevolent. Not all messages from beyond can be trusted, and not everyone who ventures into the realm of the dead returns unchanged. Their experiences serve as a gentle reminder that the mysteries of existence are deeper and more complex than any single era or worldview can fully comprehend. The Victorian age, with its remarkable blend of scientific rationalism and spiritual yearning, created the perfect conditions for exploring the boundaries between life and death. Yet, their investigations revealed as many questions as answers, as many dangers as comforts, as many reasons for caution as for hope. Tonight, as you drift toward sleep, you can take comfort in knowing that the spiritual entities that once terrorized Victorian households, the lying spirits that destroyed families with their deceptions, and the parasitic presences that attach themselves to vulnerable souls have no power over you here and now. The protective barriers of time and understanding separate you from their influence, allowing you to observe their activities from a safe distance, like watching a storm through a window while secure in your own warm shelter. The lesson of Victorian spiritualism is not that we should fear the unknown, but rather that we should approach it with wisdom, caution, and respect for the limits of human understanding. The desire to connect with something greater than ourselves, to find meaning beyond the material world, and to maintain relationships that transcend death are beautiful and natural aspects of human nature. Yet these same impulses can make us vulnerable to deception, manipulation, spiritual forces that may not have our best interests at heart. Let the experiences of those long-ago seekers settle gently into your consciousness as you prepare for sleep, serving not as sources of fear but as quiet reminders of the complexity and mystery that surrounds us all. Their courage in exploring the unknown, their willingness to question the boundaries of reality, and their ultimate discovery that some questions are better left unasked have given us valuable insights into the nature of human consciousness and the enduring power of hope and love. Rest peacefully tonight, knowing that you carry with you the wisdom gained from their experiences without bearing the burden of their risks. The voices from the other side that spoke so urgently in those Victorian séance rooms have been stilled by time. Their messages preserved only in the historical record, where they can inform and educate without the power to deceive or harm. Okay, sleep well, dream safely, and wake tomorrow to a world where the lessons of the past illuminate, okay, the path forward without constraining the possibilities that lie ahead.